Afternoon, everybody. We're ready to get started. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to everybody attending today's event. My name is Daniel Gonzalez, and I'm a reporter at the Arizona Republic, where I currently write about race, equity, and opportunity, and I've written about the state's Latino population for almost 25 years. I will be your moderator today. Joining me today are two panelists. Stella Rouse is director of the Hispanic Research Center here at ASU. She's also a professor in the School of Politics and Global Studies. Francisco Pedraza is an associate professor in ASU School of Politics and Global Studies. He's also the associate director of the Center for Latinos and Latinas and American Politics Research. Today's panel will provide a fuller picture of the current state of democracy in America. Professor Rouse and Professor Pedraza will be presenting the results of their just completed online survey of Arizona voters with a particular emphasis on the state's Latino electorate, which has become increasingly important. The number of eligible Latino voters has more than doubled in Arizona since 2000. Latinos now make up 1 in 4 eligible voters in Arizona. The Latino electorate is growing due to a number of factors, including age and citizenship. Latinos tend to be younger than the overall population, so a disproportionate number of voters turning 18 are Latinos. And growing numbers of Latino immigrants are becoming citizens and therefore eligible to vote. Their survey has just been completed, so the information you will be receiving is both fresh and timely, headed into the November 5th election, which as a reminder is just 7 short days away. After Professor Pedraza and Rouse present the results of their survey, I'd like to leave plenty of opportunity to answer your questions. So please be thinking about questions during their presentations. With that, I'd like to turn the mic over to Professor Rouse. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for those who are joining in person and via our webinar. I want to just quickly introduce one of our allies and supporters. We're both, Dr. Pedraza and I are both in the School of Politics and Global Studies, and we very much appreciate the support of the school in our efforts. And I'd like to introduce the director of the school, Ganesh Taskor, to say a few words before we get started. Ganesh.
So welcome. And so we hope to organize this event earlier in October, but we are still very glad that we managed to have it just a week before the election. I mean, I'm the director of School of Politics and Global Studies. So I have 2 distinguished guests here, Stella and Francisco, who are going to share their results based on this original survey we have conducted earlier this month. I mean, we are in Arizona. It is one of the battlegrounds in the elections. And then if you think about the American democracy, we are probably reaching an inflection point. And our job as scholars is basically try to really provide an informed and objective analysis of what voters think about the future of this country and what kind of factors affect their political behavior. So I think it will be a very informed and interesting discussion, especially in this very critical time. I mean, so I just want to say a couple of words also about Daniel himself. I mean, he was very modest not to introduce himself, given his extensive bio. Daniel is an award-winning journalist. He was a lead reporter and writer for The Wall, which basically received the 2018 Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting. He also won many different journalism awards. And I was actually impressed that he reported from many different parts of the world, from Mexico, Guatemala, Puerto Rico, Germany, Spain, Italy, and Northern Ireland. So I think he's based in Arizona, obviously, and then he basically brings this global perspective to what he does in terms of reporting. And obviously, we are actually very close to Mexico in terms of like our global connections. And he's a graduate of the Syracuse University. And before I basically leave the floor to both Francisco and Stella, I also want to say a couple of words about their research and their backgrounds. Francisco Pedraza, who's basically to my left, he's an associate professor at School of Politics and Global Studies. He's also the co-director of Clapper, which is basically, I think, I will say the premier entity at ASU on Latina politics and American politics. He has a PhD from University of Washington that he received back in 2010. And Francisco's research is primarily about political attitude formation and political behavior with a focus on the relationship between immigration and health policies. His specialty is in survey development. And I have to say that he has kind of really good expertise on developing items in both English and Spanish, which is obviously very important when we do surveys with the Latino voters in this country. Stella Rouse, she's the director of the Hispanic Research Center, which is also another very important entity at ASU. She's also a professor in my school, in School of Politics and Global Studies. She spent actually 15 years at the University of Maryland, and I'm glad that she actually ended up coming here. And she was director of a center called Center for Democracy and Civic Engagement for 3 years at University of Maryland. Her research is on identities and how they inform representation, political behavior, and participation with a focus on Latino and youth politics. Stella is the author of 3 different books, scholarly books, and then author of many different articles. I also want to acknowledge all the work which basically makes this event happen. I mean, the two primary entities which organize it, the Hispanic Research Center, led by Stella, and the Center for Latinos and Latinas and American Politics Research, which is obviously co-directed by Francisco. We also have 3 partners, including my own school, School of Politics and Global Studies, School of Transport Studies. My colleague Irasama Coronado is actually with us. She directs the school. And then finally, which is basically hosting us, the Cronkite School of Journalism. So all the effort which basically makes this kind of events are very important. I also want to acknowledge all the staff and the students who basically help us with everything which make the event very successful. So I think I will basically give the word to to Stella, and then you will take it from there. So yeah, thank you, and welcome again.
So we're going to go ahead and get started with some of sort of the highlights of our poll. And oh, good. Okay. So we're going to start a little bit talking about the survey. I think what makes our survey unique is the size of the survey. If everyone in this room and on the webinar is familiar with public surveys, oftentimes the size varies in terms of the number of respondents. And when you try to survey subpopulations like Latinos and other groups, the numbers are not super large. And so, your margin of error is much larger when you're projecting what the population or the subpopulation is thinking or saying or reporting to survey respondents. So we had an overall sample of 3,399 respondents, which makes our margin of error a little bit less than one might see in traditional polls. We had 1,200 Arizona registered voters and 440 Arizona Latino registered voters. All our sample was registered voters. Our poll was in the field for quite a while, given the population quotas we were trying to meet from September 23rd to October 11th of this year, so relatively fresh, as Daniel was saying. Respondents had an opportunity to choose whether they took the survey in English or in Spanish. They were able to choose that at the beginning, and it was a fully online survey. Okay? So we're going to start with talking a little bit about what we found in our survey in terms of candidate support, of course, the horse race, right? And what we're seeing in our poll is really a bit different than what other polls are showing, okay? We see Harris-Walz getting 51.9% of support, Trump-Vance 36.44%, and a relatively large number of either undecided, voting for someone else, or not planning to vote. Now, a lot of this, the difference in our poll, I think has to do, or one thing that we think it has to do with is question wording. When a lot of surveys ask respondents who they're going to vote for, they generally say, if you had to vote today, who would you vote for? Our question wording was much broader. It was about who do you plan to vote for, not trying to force a response. I think that left a lot of people in the undecided category. And as you will see, this is a national sample of registered voters. This is a national sample of Latino registered voters with a large number of undecided Latino voters. Okay. And This is a sample of Arizona registered voters. Again, you see a relatively large size of undecided, someone else not voting. And then Arizona Latino registered voters, okay? So fairly significant margins relative to perhaps some other surveys who are showing the contest to be much tighter than it is. Again, we think it has something to do with our question wording and the fact that we were not forcing people to actually pick a candidate on that day, on that moment, who they were going to vote for. There's, in our mind, still a lot of movement in the electorate, and certainly things that happened here in the last week could potentially make a difference in how the election falls out. Okay. Another horse race that I think people in Arizona are very interested in is the race for Kristen Sinema's seat that she is vacating this year. And as you can see, again, some larger undecided numbers in the direction that most polls are showing. Gallego leading, but by a significant margin. Again, similar question wording as we asked for the presidential race, and this is among Arizona registered voters. Arizona Latino registered voters, a similar trend, with Gallego leading Lake by about 14 points, but again, a very large number of undecided, someone else or not voting, okay? Okay, I'm gonna move on to talking a little bit about what people are saying about the most important issues in the election cycle this year. And I think there's some interesting findings when we think about looking at all registered voters, okay? So we asked respondents, what are the top issues you're thinking about? They could pick more than one issue, and then we force them to pick what is the most important issue out of the ones that you picked out that were important to you. And we're presenting the results here. We have obviously the results of all the different issues. We had a list of, it was about 10 issues that we put on the survey, 10 to 12 issues. And we also allowed them to pick other if they wanted to pick one that, or say something about something that we didn't ask about. But this is showing the results for the top issue, okay? So for example, 13.68% of respondents named increased border security as their top issue, right, of all US registered voters. 10.4% of the respondents named improved wages, and 10.07% of respondents said it was the most important issue for them was to stop Trump and the GOP agenda, okay? And that's, again, all US registered voters. For US Latino registered voters, you can see that the improved wages is still up there, just like it was for all registered voters. But we have a couple of other issues sort of around that issue that are important to Latinos. Mass shootings and gun safety was important, as well as stopping discrimination against Latinos, okay? And then for Arizona registered voters, you kind of see a pattern here. Again, increased border security, improved wages, and also important, but at a lesser level, was stopping Trump and the GOP agenda. And for Arizona Latino registered voters, improved wages, creating jobs, and increased border security as well, important to the Latino community. Okay, turning it over to you for policy preferences.
One of the strengths of the survey that we fielded is that we asked a series of questions that help us dig in a little bit more about the policy issues that are heavy on the minds of voters in general, as well as nationwide, as well as in Arizona. And top of a lot of the rhetoric, especially at the top of the ticket, but also we see in down ballot races, is the issue of immigration. And so we wanted to acknowledge that there's a real spotlight on the state of Arizona. There's a ballot initiative, Proposition 314, that is taking another bite at an or very restrictive immigration policy. And it packages a number of elements together, including empowering state and local law enforcement officials to inquire about the immigration status of individuals, but it also switches things up a little bit about the way that we treat fentanyl. And we had a suspicion that the combination of these multiple pieces into a single proposition may actually be what is nudging some voters towards a yes versus a no. And so what we did is we wanted to ask Arizona voters in particular, because we think that folks outside of the state of Arizona are going to be paying very close attention to this. Do you support Proposition 314? And we were curious to know, does the mention of fentanyl boost support for this specific proposition? And on the left-hand side, what we found is that when you mention fentanyl, the strongly support for Proposition 314 peaks at 44.69, but it's a little bit lower. That strongly support over on the right-hand side is only 38.8. These are figures that we're showing among all of Arizona's voters. And so we wanted to give you a sense that it's, by our estimate, very likely once you combine the somewhat support and strongly support, that Proposition 314 will in fact be passed by Arizona's voters this season. We also took a close look at another high-profile ballot proposition, and this one's dealing with adjusting the state's constitution to make it a fundamental right to have access to reproductive health care, in this case, access to abortion. And on the left-hand side, we're showing you what the distribution is of support for Arizona voters that are asked this question. But we know that this question is coming up in other states as well. So on the right-hand side, we're showing you what the support is for a law that's like Proposition 139. We don't actually mention 139 because other voters in other states don't get to answer the question on 139. But in all elements, just exactly the same, we found that both in Arizona and the rest of the US, registered voters appear to be combined somewhat support and strongly support somewhere around 2 out of 3 voters backing the idea that we should make a fundamental change to the state's constitution and provide these access to reproductive health care and specifically abortion. So we anticipate, based off our data, that we will see Arizona voters pass Proposition 139 in the next week or so. And then lastly, we know that heavy on the minds of the electorate are real concerns about a democracy. This is a theme that has picked up a fair amount of steam the last 2 election cycles. And we were a little bit surprised, quite frankly, but here is what we're finding. When we ask voters, how concerned or not are you that election fraud will be committed during this upcoming November election? We find that among all registered voters, this is the entire nation that we've sampled here, about 6 in 10 tell us that they are very or somewhat concerned. When we drill this down to specifically Latino voters, we see an uptick. So now I'm showing you here that it increases to about 7 in 10. You might be wondering, that's the national sample, what does this look like for the Copper State? In the Copper State, we asked this question, and among all registered voters, this is including Latinos, non-Hispanic whites, African Americans, Native Americans, Asians, and Pacific Islanders, we see that it's about that same level of concern. 6 in 10 registered voters in Arizona are concerned about fraud in the 2024 election. And that again ticks up slightly when we focus specifically on Latinos in the state of Arizona. Here, 7 in 10 telling us that they're very or somewhat concerned again that election fraud will be committed during this upcoming November election. I want to pause here because we need to acknowledge that there's definitely a concentration of the rhetoric around election fraud in one particular political party and in one particular candidate that's the top of the ticket. We know that Donald Trump has been at the center and has been chief among the candidates expressing concern about election fraud. And so we wanted to just be direct and ask, if Donald Trump loses the election, how confident are you that he will accept the results? He has, in fact, conveyed in multiple occasions that he is unlikely to accept or concede an election loss. And so we put this to the voters and asked, how confident are you that he would concede the election once all the votes are counted? So not necessarily on election night. We know that there's going to be counting taking place afterwards until the canvases are complete. And what we learned from our national sample of registered voters is that about less than half, right, are very confident or somewhat confident that he will concede, which is to say that a majority of voters in this country tell us 52.9% that they're not at all confident or not too confident that should Trump lose the election, he's unlikely to concede the loss. What does this look like when we drill down to Arizona? We find that it flips slightly, but there's still basically about half the voters in the state of Arizona concerned that should Trump face a loss, he's unlikely to concede once votes have been tallied. I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts as we think through some of this. Let me back up really quick. This is, pardon me, this is the national sample for just looking at Latinos. Here's the Arizona sample, again, reflecting that a majority, not at all confident, not too confident. And that number basically holds about the same for those that are, for registered voters that are Latino in the state of Arizona too. Now, one of the things that I'd like to sort of briefly acknowledge about these numbers is that it's very likely the case that we don't have a sense of where these concerns are coming from. There's a variety of reasons why somebody might be concerned that ballots are not being counted correctly. It could be because they feel that folks are accessing the ballot who shouldn't be. There's not a lot of evidence to suggest that claim can hold water. Certainly court cases proving to the tune of several dozen that there's not an evidentiary base for that. And there's also concern, right, that there are voter suppression tactics and policies that may keep people from accessing the ballot. And so both of those two very different causes could be feeding into some of these patterns. We just wanted to highlight that. At this moment, I'd like to invite our moderator back, who's going to offer some remarks and then begin taking questions from the audience as well. Thank you.
Thank you, professors. Thank you, Professors Pedraza and Rouse. I want to start by asking a question that I have as a journalist, and I think maybe some of you also have this question. And can you talk a little bit about how respondents were directed to the survey? How did they come across the survey to begin with? And also, was there any kind of verification to determine, if someone says they're a registered voter or Latino, or is that all just self-identification?
Is this on? Okay. So we used a very reputable survey firm called Qualtrics, who enlists panels of respondents specifically for polls, and they work with academics, they work with other entities on providing a pool of respondents for surveys. They verify, so according to their files, these are all registered voters that took our survey. We, basically, when we put our preferences in for what we wanted for the survey, these are some of the quotas or things that we wanted the survey to include, and it included registered voters, and among other things are oversample of Latinos, not only nationwide but in Arizona, and so this is all based on the panel characteristics of the respondents that they have that they provide for the surveys that we did.
And I'd also like to add that one of the concerns that is increasingly common in online surveys is the possibility that you'll have bots taking the surveys. And we have quite sophisticated techniques now in place through the vendor and then through the researchers ourselves, where we can track patterns, where you can kind of start to see how quickly are they answering the questions. And after taking a close look at the amount of time that folks spend, there's the variation that you would anticipate among human interviewers. And so we have a high degree of confidence, right, that the interviews that we are collecting and that we're reporting here come from real human beings and not bots.
But just to clarify, so how would a respondent come across the survey? Are they contacted or they come across it on their own?
So they're recruited by the survey firms to be part of their panels, and they may call on a particular respondent, once a month, twice a month. Probably at this time period where a lot of people are doing surveys, they may be calling on the respondents much more often. They are generally part of this participation pool where they actually receive some sort of benefit. Oftentimes it's like online credits for things, to be just part of the participation, not to participate on a particular poll, but to be part of the panel. So they are recruited into being part of the panels that then the survey firms use for respondents that they provide for those who are looking to do the surveys.
Okay, I see. Thank you. Before I get into some of the questions, some of the specific questions about the results, I wanted to ask also about I know this struck me as the high percentage of undecideds that you came across. Is that because the survey was started in August and had the period of time, or what would you attribute that to?
Yeah, I think so. One of the things that Professor Rouse pointed out is that there's differences in question wordings, and we wanted to make sure that we could see the extent to which voters were in fact expressing that they hadn't completely decided. A lot of pollsters, they force respondents to answer if you had to choose today in order to get the two specific figures. How much support is there, for instance, for the Trump-Vance ticket and then the Harris-Walz ticket? But that removes the possibility, right, that there are genuinely voters out there who haven't made up their mind entirely or might be reluctant to express at that moment who they wish to support. And so we wanted to leave the possibility that there were, in fact, and especially in the state of Arizona, despite the massive investments in campaigns and information that we're awash in, still voters who haven't completely decided, which is really encouraging, I think, from the standpoint of campaigning and for political operatives. This is why they're still out there canvassing and pounding the pavement, because they know there's voters who haven't yet cast their ballot and they're wondering, are they persuadable? Our data says, to some extent, for a few, that may in fact be the case.
I'll also just add really quickly that there's a big element of social desirability in answering polls, particularly asking about horse races, and particularly when it's two candidates that are, we are in a very polarized environment. And so allowing respondents the freedom to not have to sort of answer a question in a way that they might not be fully comfortable or set on answering, for us, that makes a difference. I think it's important, and we'll see how the numbers pan out in the end when the election rolls around. But I do think that we captured an element of uncertainty, perhaps, that other polls are missing.
Thank you. One of the things I wanted to note that what really stands out about this poll is that we have representative samples of Arizona voters, Arizona Latina voters in particular, and then we have comparisons to their counterparts in the nation. And I'm wondering, what were some of the patterns or results that really surprised you or stuck out?
Well, we weren't too surprised to see that there was a fair amount of matching on the horse races. So when it comes to the contest at the top of the ticket, voting for president, Latinos in the state of Arizona are not that different from the overall pattern that we see among all Latinos in the rest of the nation. You could definitely pinpoint some differences if you were to focus on Latinos, say, in one state, like Florida. You would expect to see some differences there. But when we think about the entire nation overall, we see fairly similar numbers. So that's in terms of matching. Now, where we might see some differences, and we do observe a slight difference, is in the issues that are driving the voters to the poll and what's at the top of their mind. It's really hard to live in Arizona and not be concerned with or addressing or exposed to debates surrounding immigration. We know that that's a national issue, but it is definitely acute in the state of Arizona. And when we interview Latinos here, that comes out in the things that they report as the most important issue.
Yeah, in particular, we saw the results about border security. Latinos are, we would think that they might not pick border security as being an issue that they care about, that they would be perhaps more in favor of less restrictive immigration policy. But I think it's a real concern for Latinos, and particularly those living in border towns, the issue of border security and the resources that those towns have had to expend. And so I think it has become a broader issue in terms of security mattering to Latinos, in terms of parties talking more about security. And so while that wasn't surprising, I think it is in line with everything that we've seen about the border being a primary issue for Arizona voters, and particularly Arizona Latino voters.
I have a couple more questions, but I want to make sure that I have enough opportunity for others to ask questions. So I'm going to ask one quick question more, and then I'll open it up to the floor. You mentioned that the survey, that some of the respondents took the survey in Spanish, or that was an opportunity. I'm wondering if you have an idea how many people actually took the survey in Spanish and if their responses differed at all from other Latinos.
Yeah, this will give us a chance to talk a little bit about the some of the technical aspects of the survey. We want to make sure that we offer to Latino respondents in particular the option to complete the survey in Spanish language. When we survey Latinos and that option is not made available, it's very clear that a lot of the responses come looking different from polls that do offer the option. And so on that level, we definitely hit a home run of just under half of Latinos completed the Spanish, or excuse me, the interview in English language, so meaning about a majority. That's a little bit more than you would expect in terms of how many Latinos are Spanish language proficient. However, we do rely, of course, on weighting the survey to make sure that we get as close as we possibly can a reflection of the entire Latino population in terms of demographic profiles by gender, income levels, age, to name a few.
Thank you. Okay, well, I'd like to open up the floor to questions from journalists. Professor?
Yes. As both of you know, one of the most salient topics nowadays is the increasing gender gap. Especially when you look at the Gen Z voters, there's actually increasing evidence that behavior of the woman seems to look very different than the behavior of the man when it comes to political, like the preferences. Do you see the same thing in your survey, specifically about the Latinos in Arizona?
We did find some gender gap across men and women overall, with women obviously being more supportive for reproductive health rights and all the things that we would expect to see a gender gap. It's not as big as some of the gender gaps that other surveys are reporting, or sort of the overall narrative of a huge gender gap. We'll see how it falls out when voting happens. But certainly among young people and young Latinos, there is a larger gender gap than there is overall when you look at men and women together.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for detailing the results of the survey. It was really interesting, especially the sample size that you had. I'm particularly curious about that block of voters who remain undecided or choosing to vote for somebody else. I'm curious, I mean, we're so close to Election Day, less than a week out. Would you be able to provide any insight as to why those voters still remain undecided so close to the day they're going out to vote?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we have had lots of back and forth on is that as political scientists, we're in this moment where the fundamentals that we were trained to keep an eye on and to use to structure our analysis just don't exist in the same way that they used to. That we are, people say every election's like, but this one's different, but this one really is different. The layered on top of normal policy debates, questions around the integrity of our election systems, the normalizing of rhetoric and behavior that just even 10 years ago, we would have been aghast at and certainly felt like that cannot be happening here in the United States. It's hard to know just how much of that has been injected and now starting to affect the way that people respond when we interview them. And I think that may be some of what's going on, is that the social desirability to say you support one candidate or another may be a little more acute. That could be going on. And it could also be the case that, especially when we're looking at in the state of Arizona, as Daniel had pointed out earlier, 1 in 4 voters now are Latino. And we have to acknowledge that a good amount of those voters are new. And when I say new, it's not just that they're aging. Every month, 90,000 new Latino voters become eligible to vote. And there's a fair number of them, not all, of course, but they're concentrated in the Southwest, including Arizona. And so we have to stop and think about how That newness to the electorate means that there's a whole set of knowledges, familiarity, understanding about the way that elections work, the parties, et cetera, that I think people are still in the middle of processing, still learning, becoming familiar with.
I'll just add really quickly that the other fundamentals that don't hold here is that this is an unusual election in that you're having a former incumbent run for re-election. You're having the vice president come into an election cycle literally at the tail end of the election cycle. She's been a candidate for all of 3 months, right? You don't have the actual incumbent running. And so I think that changes the fundamentals about how people look at the election and how they respond to questions about the election. That's why some polls it's neck and neck, others there's a bigger distance. There's not a coalescing around sort of the data as we typically see in what we would call more normal election cycles, and that's because there's so many things challenging the fundamentals of this election, what Dr. Pedraza mentioned, as well as the fact that it's so unusual. This should be a referendum on the incumbent. We don't have an incumbent. We have a former president who was an incumbent trying to run as the outsider, right? Which doesn't fit the, sort of the narrative very well since he served president for 4 years. And so how do voters sort of take all that in and answer a question about who they intend to vote for when we're still, when we finished this poll, it was still, 3 weeks out from the election. So I think all those things matter in trying to determine what people are thinking and what their preferences are in a snapshot in time.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much, professors, and thank you so much. It was a very insightful and very valuable presentation. A couple of questions, if I may. First, in terms of the issue prioritizations, in a lot of polling, in a lot of surveys, pollsters do the economy in general, but I noticed that you sort of divided it into wages, into job creation, into inflation. So I was sort of wanted to ask if you would like to remark upon on that and tell us more behind the thinking and what you find, how does it differ from the insights that might be derived from other polls, other pollsters. Second, I would also like to ask about, so in terms of the horse race, so alongside the obvious difference of the head-to-head polling, because we also do the state of Arizona specifically, and normally what we've seen out there when it comes to the senator race, normally the gap is sort of larger between Galileo and Lake. But in this poll, if I'm not mistaken, basically we are seeing roughly the same gap between Harris Watts, Trump Vance, and Galileo Lake. So is that, and that's on top of course, the slightly larger undecided don't knows. Does that fit? To what extent do you think that fits with the narrative or the explanation that a lot of Democratic voters are more high propensity voters and high interest voters, whereas a lot of Trump Lake voters may be less so? And finally, a very general, broad question, because you also talked about the gender gap and the prevalent narrative surrounding that, especially within Latinos. Amongst Latinos, sorry. I would also like to ask, generally, based on this data, are you prepared to, I don't know, perhaps rebut or perhaps cast a doubt on, say, hold your horses on certain prevalent narratives or explanation or hypothesis out there? Thank you.
So I'll tackle the issue one first. So we really wanted, the economy is a big issue. Like, do you care about the economy? Everybody cares about the economy, right? And what the economy means to people, it means different things, right? So if you poll someone and say, is the economy the #1 issue? You might not know what part of the economy they're thinking about when they're answering that question. And so we were very interested in wanting to dig in, obviously, further than just the economy and particular aspects of the economy that people are concerned about, that they're prioritizing in this election. And I think we captured that really well. We saw a theme up there when we look at voters across the country, Latino voters across the country, Arizona voters, Arizona Latino voters, that there are different aspects of the economy that they all come through as being one of the top 3 issues for people, depending on what we're talking about. Wages and income is a huge one, right? Jobs is another one. So we really wanted to dig that in. And what we found was that inflation really didn't come up as one of the top 3 issues, right? Where some polls have shown, or maybe are extrapolating the fact that people are concerned about the economy, that it really is inflation. So I think that's a little bit different in terms of what we're finding with that respect. But I think it's really important to dig into that because the economy is such a broad issue that means so many different things.
Thank you. I'll comment briefly on the comparison between the top of the ticket and the Senate race. Yeah, there is a slightly larger gap for the Senate race, but it isn't what other pollsters have been picking up. And I think we just come back to the way that we ask the question, just leaving the option for folks to declare someone else or undecided goes a long way to explaining that. Patterns that we saw that would help us or lead us to say, slow down, hold your horses. One of the things that we've been emphasizing is that we wanted to probe these questions about people's views about the candidates accepting election results, because it is especially prominent here. We're in Maricopa County, and this is now, I think, it may be the fifth largest in terms of the number of voters that they have to process. And it's also ground zero for a real heated debate that's taking place primarily inside the Republican Party, but is clearly spilling over and affecting the rest of the electorate in terms of confidence that election administrators have, that voters have in election administrators to process and count and tally all the votes in a way that squares with what the people want. And so I don't want to overemphasize this too much, but that is one of the things, the elements, the features that is distinct about this election cycle. And we have election officials here who have said as much and remind us that it's different, not just because of the mere tallying, but they have reported that their personal safety, right, has come up as an issue. And that's where things start to change. And so we do want to focus on the outcome itself, but it is very likely that it will be a close outcome. And I think we all need to prepare ourselves that it will be a close outcome. And because it is a close outcome, these patterns in people's views of the election are extremely important.
Did we answer all your questions? I just wanted to make sure, was there something we...
Points on whether it conforms with the idea of Democrats primarily attracting, or the voter base being more high propensity voters, whereas Trump and Lake may be attracting more low propensity voters, therefore more of them appears in the undecided column. Does that fit, or is this something of a, of a stretch? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I'll confess, I haven't dug into the education stuff as closely as we probably should, and we can get back with you. We have the crosstabs for education, which would tell us something about this. One interesting thing that seems to be coming up this election is certainly the idea that in the past, more high propensity voters tended to vote early, and lower propensity Republican voters tended to vote day of election. A lot of that had to do with the candidates sort of telling people when to vote and when not to vote, and what method of voting might not be on the up and up, right? That has changed this election cycle. We see in a lot of states, and a lot of the data that we have seen, where there are a lot of Republicans who are voting early, even outpacing Democrats in some states. And so we'll see if those sort of what we think about fundamentals about who votes and when their vote are going to hold up, depending on high propensity versus low propensity, and what difference that may make in the end in terms of the election outcome.
We're gonna take a question from our Zoom.
Perfect.
So Faith asks, were the results presented based on weighted data, and if so, could you elaborate on the weighting scheme?
Yes, we're very mindful to report all the crosstabs as weighted, and we do that because we want to make sure that we've done due diligence to have the actual numbers that we've collected come as close in terms of what we tabulate to reflecting the overall population. And we use well-known and well-used methodologies called raking, where we take known quantities of the demographic profile in the country and we match them up against what we collected, and we make slight adjustments until that match is complete.